Are you lonely? In general, what is loneliness? The dictionary somewhat philosophically interprets this word phenomenon state, affected with, characterized by, or causing a depression feeling of being alone, lonesome, lone, solitary, without company, standing apart, isolated. Loneliness is experienced by everyone without exception. It is an emotion like the joy of a new purchase or the nervousness of being stuck in traffic. This state is completely subjective. You can feel lonely in a crowd, at home, or even with loved ones. This video is also subjective. I began my adventure with understanding of loneliness by searching for the answer to the question, what is the history of this phenomenon? After all, in most cases, loneliness carries a negative connotation, and that's something people want to avoid. This phenomenon is not new to humans. I'm sure most of you have seen some research on social media or modern trends in remote work, so it seems that loneliness is a fairly new trend. Nevertheless, researchers argue that it even has its own ancient history. Mr. Vivek Murphy, in his book Together, the Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World, analyzed the most popular theories about this phenomenon and described how Oxford anthropologists proved that loneliness have been around for almost 52 million years, tracing its roots back to the first primates. Monkeys need to exist in a certain social group, either a family or a tribe. Without it, they simply do not survive. Researchers believe that this is even more relevant for humans, because evolutionarily our bodies and our nervous system in particular have learned to fight loneliness. The breathing and heartbeat of a person accelerate, the pressure rises and sleep problems begin. Instinctively, a person begins to fight this, trying to communicate with others. Although this phenomenon has been around for many years, it used to be less common than it is now. I operate more with the data from American studies, nevertheless, it seems to me that they illustrate the general picture quite accurately. Until the 1960s, single-person households were a rather rare phenomenon, but in the last 50 years, this figure has doubled. Now, in the United States, it is the second most popular type of household, surpassing even families with children. This is most common in large cities, where single residents make up about 40% of the population. In some areas of Manhattan and Washington, this figure reaches 2/3. I will leave some materials on this topic in the description if someone is interested. Some researchers even use the term loneliness epidemic. But someone might wonder, what do games have to do with it, and why am I not talking about them right now? Since games, to a large extent, are also a form of creativity like music or movies, they also convey the feelings of the people who created them. So how do developers convey this feeling? The formula for the ideal loneliness seemed to me created in games almost from the moment they existed. Take Mario, for example. All the time we run forward, and along the way we only encounter turtles, some plants, and at the very end, Bowser. Rarely in any game from 80s or 90s we did have partners or even friendly faces. Everything followed the film trends of that time, when more often the main and only active person was the main character, besides the hordes of goons, of course. Mostly we had a pumped up superhero. Moreover, justice is such a rare phenomenon that fighters for it, and accordingly players, had to fight everything themselves. Let's remember action movies with Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Robocop, and from there the transformation into Duke Nukem, Doom, Blood, and Shadow Warrior. Such were the trends. However, personally I never felt lonely in such games, even in the depressing Demolition Man. In such games there are so many enemies and events that in the heat of action you simply don't have time to think about anything else. You need to keep moving forward constantly. Take Contra, for example. Something is constantly exploding, flying around, and we have to shoot everything in sight. Although in Wolfenstein, during breaks between hunting villains, we wandered through levels in search of keys or doors. What else can convey the feeling of loneliness if not running around isolated corridors without any signs of life? However, none of these blockbusters managed to captivate me. They couldn't convey the feeling of loneliness, even though everything was built around the principle of one-man army, which should perfectly fit in the mood. In my desire to answer the question why games back then simply could not create the necessary atmosphere, at first I thought it happened due to lack of technology, and almost instantly I remembered how the media tried to cancel even the early Mortal Kombat games due to excessive violence. Of course, now those pixelated frames look quite primitive, but people's perception was different back then. In my search for an answer for the question of why early games did not create this mood, I came to the conclusion that the era and the people lived in, and accordingly the state of the industry, were not ready for more serious topics. I believe that technology could not limit gaming creativity. Take Faith, for example. It was released in 2017. The game graphics and mechanics were present in the early 90s. It's a quite popular horror adventure that precisely conveys the feelings of loneliness, inevitability and fear. Everything is done through an excellent plot and a few possible endings. It's hard to say anything about this game without spoilers. I'll just emphasize that at the beginning of its evolution path, games did not know how and did not want to create certain emotions and impressions. At that stage, they were still entertainments. Some are more serious, some are less. It's like it was with movies. At first, the cinema showed primitive comedy, soap dramas, and only with time did we get more complex and mentally difficult films. And now I want to talk a bit about personal experience. Quite unusual, but the first game that brought a certain feeling of melancholy to me was Lotus Turbo Challenge 91 for the Sega. A somewhat specific choice, wouldn't you agree? It's hard to describe childhood impressions from 2 decades ago, nevertheless I'll try. I was somehow captivated by the constant repetition. The same trees, the same signs, a background that seemed so close yet so far away. Although the game has virtual opponents, they serve only as possible obstacles. The real opponent is yourself. Here we race against the clock, trying to reach checkpoints. And what the better way to convey the feeling of loneliness than a duel with yourself and your own skills. However, truly alone for the first time I was in Silent Hill. A paradox. Technical limitations of that time, which couldn't reproduce that feeling in platformers, achieved it on the first PlayStation. This console wasn't very powerful, so developers unintentionally created a fog that limited the drawing distance. As a result, a mistake gifted one of the most atmospheric games. For me, the first game in this series was the sequel, especially with the expansion where we play as Maria. I won't say I'm a big fan of horror or survival horror, but the uniqueness of this game is hard to deny. The feeling we are discussing is conveyed in several ways. Script-wise, most of the time we are on our own search. Atmospherically, visual representation, overall art style, and unmatched music, at least in the second game. It perfectly conveys the mood and underscores it. And in the gameplay itself, where we are constantly alone and often in danger. In contrast, let's look at the quite identical Resident Evil series. Both are third-person survival horrors, searching for supplies, fighting monsters, but are we really alone in Raccoon City? So why does Silent Hill has this unbeatable atmosphere and Resident Evil doesn't? I think it's about calmness and danger. Although the city with fog has equally dangerous monsters, they are fewer and encountered less frequently. Danger is perceived more as a companion rather than opponent. In Alien Isolation, where the very title speaks of isolation and danger, the concept of loneliness, on the contrary, is elevated to an absolute. It's the main gameplay element enhanced by graphics and outstanding sound design. Since encounters with the alien are generated randomly, the players go through the game differently. You can never be sure when such an encounter will happen. An interesting point here. Loneliness is generally considered as a negative phenomenon, but in Alien Isolation you would rather be alone than in company of an extraterrestrial friend. Everything revolves around the feeling of fear, even oppressive discomfort. I can't say that the player is entirely helpless, but our abilities to fight the alien are quite limited. There is a play of contrasts. On one hand, these encounters are cool as a gaming experience, and on the other, you want to avoid them because they are awesomely terrifying. In general, the entire horror genre is built on loneliness, which is conveyed through the sensation of fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of unknown and unbeatable. Like in the real life, loneliness can be different, and horrors are an essential part of video games and the spectrum of emotions they create. But as I said, I personally don't like this genre. It doesn't give me that I'm looking for. I want to contemplate, immerse myself in melancholy, and fear doesn't give time for reflection, it urges action. Therefore, in my search, I turned to Half-Life, to the second game of this famous series. In general, I sincerely like the trend of humanizing Gordon Freeman. If we recall how this game was perceived about 10 years ago, what was it like? Yes, undoubtedly a great shooter, a cool story, a fun engine, some jokes, memes, mods, and then about 3 years ago, fans of the series began to take Gordon much more seriously. People started to ask what did he feel and how did he go through his difficult path. Artists started creating quite mature animations that raise important topics in the context of the universe. For instance, what do you think the first two Half-Life games are about? About random coincidence, alien invasion, overcoming obstacles, higher powers, friendship, a practical demonstration of dystopia? Perhaps that's how these games were perceived a bit earlier, but in the last 3 or so years, players have started to raise another topic that pierces through the series entirely: the loneliness of Gordon. For 27-year-old physicist, events of the game unfold within a week, not over 20 years like for other people. How do you think a person feels who went to the work in the morning, saw a normal world, and then after lunch have to save it just to witness its decay? Although the games don't directly pose this question, I no longer perceive the adventures of the Silent Freeman in the same way as before. The first game somewhat conveys all these impressions in its own way because everything happens more dynamically, and we are mostly running forward towards our goal. However, the second game provides that desired melancholy that I like so much. The gameplay itself has slowed down, not for the sake of this mood of course, but due to the new engine and the ability of the main character. Battles have become more positional because the gravity gun in the gameplay depends on game objects that, whether you want it or not, must stand in specific places, and the game segments themselves have become more distinct: combat, exploring the world, puzzles, combat, exploration, puzzle. Thus, we don't always rush forward, we have time at our disposal. New graphic capabilities allowed for creating a pleasant environment that still looks quite charming even after all these years. The loneliness of Half-Life is completely different from that in Silent Hill. Although the means are the same, the atmosphere, the moods are radically different. Now when playing the second Half-Life, I've gotten into the habit of admiring the local landscapes. The game itself carries a bitter taste, and when you contemplate Gordon's feelings, a suffocating loneliness begins to envelop. Again, it's not an opponent in this game, it's not an ally, it is an artistic tool that perhaps the developers didn't consciously create. Nevertheless, it is hard to find the atmosphere of this world and the impressions from it in other games. A bit dramatic perhaps, but this is how I feel. If in previous games loneliness was often an indirect phenomenon that emerged due to a combination of various factors, there are works that are built on this feeling. In particular, I'm talking about Journey. It is difficult to describe the local beauty in words, and the concept of the game is remarkable. It is genuine modern philosophy as it is. It's challenging to categorize Journey, as it is a unique canvas. Everyone will perceive this game differently, but let's call it a platformer. The gameplay itself seamlessly aligns with the theme of this video, but I want to draw attention to an interesting nuance. Technically, it is both single-player and multiplayer game. The thing is that you can randomly encounter a human player in the world, but there is no interaction with this person as such. You just exist. There is no in-game chat, no emotions. Your journey is as unique as the encounter with another player. Your solitude in the world is the solitude of people like you. It belongs only to you and, at the same time, to all other players. Previously, I gave an example of internal struggle, scripted and atmospheric loneliness, and here it is built into the gameplay itself. Journey is truly a unique creation because it can function as an experience, a concept, or something even bigger. So far, no one has done anything similar to this game. At the beginning, I said that loneliness is often perceived as a negative phenomenon, but there are examples when it can be positive. Take DayZ, for example. This online game largely revolves around communication between the real people. It seems like we've been thrown into quite challenging conditions and we have to survive. Isn't it easier to do it in the company of other players? But if you've been running around in this game, or even just watched the footage on YouTube, you should have a completely different impression. DayZ players often show their real nature and do things that they wouldn't dare to do in the real world. rob, betray, and even torture. Surviving on your own is just simpler. You quickly learn to avoid other people because they are usually more dangerous than zombies. At least you know what to expect from zombies. Here, loneliness becomes a guarantee of safety, surprisingly. This feeling is conveyed through other people. Loneliness as means of communication. You begin to appreciate it and understand that the real player is a real threat. Speaking of open worlds, a few words about single player and sandboxes. Take Minecraft or Terraria for example. They have everything to make you feel lonely and convey that feeling. Gameplay focused on digging or going alone for hours, dangerous monsters, and a corresponding atmosphere. But I don't know, personally I didn't experience any discomfort or melancholy in these titles. Perhaps it's my issue. Sometimes I didn't take these games so seriously. They are definitely good and I would even say outstanding, but they didn't evoke deep feelings in me. Of course, sandboxes were not designed to do so. I'm just conveying my impressions. Maybe someone experienced it differently. Now talking about single-player open worlds, it's a different situation. Of course, they can be different and in some games the world technically works better because it's more filled and they aimed at specific impressions. But let's take one of the most popular ones, Skyrim for example. What do we have here? An interesting world that, through scripts, constantly tries to create the illusion of events. You're constantly going somewhere, and especially if you turn away from the main road, you often find adventures in your cozy place. This masks the fact that the game is essentially a cave cleaning simulator. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that it doesn't provide pleasant impressions and convey specific emotions. Take the journey to High Hrothgar at the beginning of the game. A rather trivial task of a simple, except for the troll at the end, climb up the mountain. But how does it deliver the atmosphere? Here you feel like a lonely but unique savior of the world, Dragonborn. I think everyone at some point during the playthrough stops running around and just goes to admire the mountains. In general, Skyrim also conveys loneliness as a mood through atmosphere, although I tend to think that this transmission works more through the visual part here. In other games, it's not so vividly expressed. Snow-covered slopes and roads, snowstorms, dark caves, and mythical afterlife work on their own. Even music and gameplay are not necessary. I would say the same about No Man's Sky. On a visual level, it conveys the calmness and the sense of loneliness. It's understandable because we are in space. In general, the story of development of this game is quite dramatic and deserves a separate video, but for now, I'll just note that it fits well with our theme. If we talk about GTA or Saints Row for example, you won't find loneliness there. At least not in the newer games in the series. They are more aimed at fun, which is not a downside of course, each game pursues its goals in its concept. Although I remembered my favorite entertainment in the third game, listening to music and driving in the rain. Create your own melancholy. As I mentioned previously, you can feel lonely even in a crowd. Games, like other forms of art, music, movies, books, convey the moods and feelings of the people who create them. Goals in specific games are always different, and they can be achieved in various ways. I talked about creating the necessary atmosphere, a combination of visuals and sound, using graphics and certain visual techniques, using a script, and directly by gameplay and gaming concept. Often people play for escapism, which means escaping from the real world. And just as you can escape from many things, you can also look for something of your own. Loneliness, as I said, is generally perceived rather negatively, but there are also who seek it. It is not always a bad phenomenon, and sometimes there are just moments of melancholy that you want to share with yourself. Loneliness is not bad, and I am satisfied with the fact that this emotion, this feeling, has significant representation in games. They have become deeper, more serious. They have learned to speak of complex issues and ask uncomfortable and important questions. So let's go back to the question I've asked at the beginning. Are you lonely?